I want to tell a story from a long time ago, from before I, Johan Stensley, was born in North Dakota in 1999, before my mother, Tone-Lise Gjertsen, left Norway to study in the United States in 1983. Before her mother, Asta Maria Tønnjem, danced with my grandfather for the first time in 1954. Before her father, Einar Tønnjem, became determined to marry one of the Fleischer sisters in the 1920s. Before his mother, Petra Einarsson, gained the right to vote in 1913. And before her father, Carl Einarsson, was hired to be the first set designer and master machinist for Bergen's New Theatre in 1876. This story begins exactly 200 years ago, when my great-great-great-great-grandmother, Caroline Margrethe Knudsen Sæbø, was born on February 18th, 1826, in the city of Trondheim. Carolina was born in a house here on Kongens Gate. Her mother, Margrethe Jensgaard, came from a family of fishermen and farmers just west of the city, while her father, Peder Sæbø, was originally from a coastal farm in Romsdal. After being orphaned at 10 years old, he worked as a farmhand for several years before eventually moving to the city, where he was employed at the rope works just south of Margrethe's neighborhood. Soon enough, they crossed paths, married, and started a family together. Their first son, though, died when he was just 5 years old, but 3 children survived: Anna Maria, Caroline Margrethe, and Mikkel Mortinus. Two months after her birth, Carolina entered the historical record for the first time as Pastor Jonas Angel opened the church books of Nidarosdomen and recorded her baptism. In doing this, he preserved a window to the world she was born into by writing down her parents' names, occupation, and residence, in addition to the identities of her 6 godparents, including a tailor, a fisherman, a sailor, a barrel maker's wife, and her aunts, Marit and Maria. This is where Carolina was baptized, Nidarosdomen. The church has been reshaped and transformed through centuries of additions and renovations, but the original construction began nearly 1,000 years ago in 1070. Carolina was remembered as a deeply religious person who, according to her youngest son, was kind, genuinely humble, but his one criticism of her was that she trusted in her pastors as if they were gods themselves. The first of these influential pastors in her life was a man known locally as Kaureng. He's buried here, but preached at Nidarosdomen from her infancy until she turned 19. Kaureng was beloved by many, and was described as devout and sensible with a touch of wit and humor. Physically, he was small and thin, clean-shaven with a high forehead and white hair, and he spoke slowly and earnestly, but had the peculiar habit of always preaching with his eyes closed. In the spring of 1840, 14-year-old Carolina was confirmed by Kaureng. She was the only one among her siblings to receive the commendable grade meget godt, or very good, for Christian knowledge, diligence, and behavior. Carolina's faith and worldview were shaped within these walls as she reflected on the sermons of Pastor Kaureng, sang hymns from the Evangeliske Kristelige Salmebok, and listen to the church's organ, which was constructed nearly 300 years ago and is remarkably still in use today. Shortly before Carolina's birth, her father started working as a shoemaker. Then, when she was 6 years old, he took out a significant loan to purchase a fenced plot of land in Kolvshine, complete with a small garden pavilion. Today, it's a library, but it was here where Peter hoped to build a new life for his family and establish a name for himself as one of the city's gardeners. According to his advertisements published in the local newspapers, we know that Peder grew and sold cabbage, rutabaga, celery, parsley, onions, leeks, radishes, flowers, and much more. Then, by the time Carolina had turned 12 years old, he'd started sailing his own small ship every year to Kristiansund to sell his produce. Within a single generation, Peder had remade himself from a farmhand to a ropeworks laborer to a shoemaker and now a well-established gardener. Carolina had little to no relationship with her father's side of the family. Her paternal grandparents and aunt died long before she was born, and the few relatives who remained lived far away. Her mother's side, on the other hand, was closely woven into her daily life, and she likely spent many hours at her grandparents' house, which is simply a parking lot today. She lost her grandfather when she was 7 years old, and her grandmother at 11, but the house where her own mother was born stayed in the family and was inherited by her dear aunt and godmother, Maria. Notably, all of Carolina's uncles and aunts were sailors, or married sailors. 2 of them even became captains of their own ships. However, the sea that sustained them also cost them dearly, as her uncle Jörgen died in a shipwreck when she was 10 years old, followed by her uncle Sivert and 2 cousins several years later. Hard times came when Carolina was 17 and the family garden was auctioned off due to her father's debts. Within 2 months, Peder took a desperate risk and signed a 5-year lease for Jonsløkken, just south of the Nidelven River. The property came with a stunning view, a barn, fruit trees, and several small greenhouses, but the price was staggering, and his contract stated that if he fell behind on payments, his landlord could seize his crops. It also required that Peder maintain the property, haul in at least 200 loads of manure each year, and grow root crops and herbs, while being forbidden from growing potatoes or fishing. Immediately after signing the lease, he borrowed money from his new landlord, Christian Lorch Skive, putting up everything he owned, present and future, as collateral, and even consenting to have his property auctioned without a summons or a court judgment if necessary. 2 years later, it all collapsed. In 1845, Peder filed for bankruptcy and his estate was sold off, including household goods, garden produce, tools, hay, and straw. That autumn, he printed his last known advertisement selling vegetables, but now, for the first time, he offered to deliver them directly to customers' homes free of charge. Not long after, the family scattered. In 1848, Carolina's sister Anna married a 3rd-generation barrel maker, and in July 1849, the couple moved to his home city of Bergen. A year later, in June 1850, Carolina, at 24 years old, left Trondheim to join them. Then, in the following month, their brother Mikkel moved north to the Ulsthaug Islands, where he worked as a bricklayer and married a local farm girl. For several years, he traveled across the country from one construction project to the next, but in September 1855, a few months after their mother died, he ended up joining his sisters in Bergen, where he found steady work rebuilding the city after its most recent fire. By then, Anna, Carolina, and Mikkel were all living in the place that would shape the rest of their lives. Little is known of Carolina's earliest years in Bergen, but sources suggest that she lived with her sister on Nordnesveien before eventually being hired as a servant by Madame Jonsson, a skipper's widow who lived on the southern side of the Nordnes Peninsula. While working here, Carolina entered into an intimate relationship with Stefan Einarsson, who is described as a short, bearded man of average weight with light hair and big blue eyes. Stefan had been orphaned at 10 years old after his mother died in childbirth and his father drowned in a terrible accident. Then, in 1847, he had moved to the city from the nearby island of Osterøy to work as a carpenter, and he was 26 years old, my age, when Carolina became pregnant with their child. It would have been no surprise if they'd rushed into a wedding in order to avoid the shame associated with having a child out of wedlock, but most likely for financial reasons, that didn't happen. And in the summer of 1854, Carolina gave birth to an illegitimate son in Madame Jonsson's house. 6 weeks later, the newborn, named Karl, was baptized here at Nykirken. And 8 months after that, Carolina and Stefan were married in the same church in 1855. One can hope that Carolina and Stefan loved each other. But unfortunately, married life proved to be remarkably painful, as their son Oscar later revealed.
My father led his family a miserable life, for after he was married, he became a drunkard. From Saturday, when he received his salary, he was usually drunk until Monday morning. Oftentimes on Sunday morning, my father came to my bedside and offered me a glass of wine. But I was very tired and disgusted to see my father drunk.
Stefan's drinking was likely encouraged by his older brother Jakob, who appears to have been one of his closest friends. But while Stefan was described as a miserable alcoholic, Jakob was described far more severely by his adopted daughter Fredrika as an abusive one.
Tante Annas mann var forfallen til drukkenskap, og når han var beruset, var tante bedrøvet og gråt. Mot meg var han slem, og sa mange onde ord til meg, og jeg var stadig redd for ham.
Fredrika went on to write that Jakob did things too terrible to name. When Saturday came, the Einarsson brothers may have gone out together, and after a late night of drinking, Jakob returned to a fearful family, as Stefan returned to a neglected one. Within the first 4 years of their marriage, Carolina gave birth to 3 more children: Stefanus, her only daughter Katinka, and Martin. Tragically, all 3 died in early childhood, Katinka at 10 months, Martin at 1 year, and Stefanus at 6. As they buried their children, the Einarssons also struggled to survive themselves. They relied on welfare and rarely stayed in one place for long. Between Karl's birth in 1854 and the arrival of their next surviving son in 1862, another boy named Martin, they moved at least 7 times. Most moves were within Bergen, but in 1860, only a month after Stavanger was devastated by the largest fire in the city's history, the family relocated there. Rebuilding created steady work for carpenters, and the Einarssons were desperate for a reliable income. After 2 years in Stavanger, they returned to Bergen, and by 1865, the Einarssons had 3 living children: 11-year-old Karl, 3-year-old Martin, and a newborn, Stefanus. That December, the Carpenters Guild accused Stefan of illegally accepting work. He was a skilled carpenter, specializing in stairs, but he was still only a journeyman. That meant he was not permitted to present himself as a master or to accept jobs without a master's supervision. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to 3 nights in prison. Fortunately, Following Stefan's return from prison, the Einarssons seem to have finally passed through one of the darkest periods of their family's story. Although there were still notable hardships to come, Stefan and Karolina never again had to witness the death of a child. They became more financially stable, and their constant moving came to an end. In 1866, despite years of loss and poverty, the Einarssons remarkably managed to secure a home here at Skivebakken 7. Their son, Oscar, later insisted that it was Karolina who purchased the property, even though legal records list Stefan as the owner. Regardless, it was likely Karolina's inheritance from earlier that year which made the purchase possible. At the time, Skivebakken 7 was a one-story wooden building painted yellow with an attic and a gabled roof. The ground floor held a living room, 2 bedrooms, a storage closet, and a kitchen, while the attic included a single room and a stove. It's also worth noting who their long-term neighbors were. At Skivebakken 9 lived steamship engineer Østen Larsen, who later died in a shipwreck between Nagasaki and Shanghai. And then down here, right beside them at Skivebakken 5, lived sawmiller Anders Borge, who grew up on the same island as Stefan. But across from them is where their wealthiest neighbor lived. Right here at Skivebakken 6, this was the house of Judge Ole Bø. And according to one local story, the neighborhood kids, who were usually a source of much chaos, always stepped aside respectfully when Judge Bø came walking past. In 1867, Karolina's 4th surviving son, Oscar, was born here. And in 1870, she gave birth to their last child, Petrus. Now, with 5 living sons, Karl, Martin, Stefanus, Oscar, and Petrus, the Einarsson family was complete. According to the memories of her children, Karolina was affectionate and dependable. She kissed them in the morning and taught them to pray at night. In the words of Petrus,
Min mor var et eiegodt menneske og meget religiøs, uten å overdrive som så mange dessverre gjør.
And in the words of Oscar,
My mother was a very kind-hearted, earnest, and faithful Christian woman, and I was very much attached to her.
While she kept track of finances and tenants, she also cooked, cleaned, and raised 5 growing boys, which in itself was no small task.
Ja, stakkars mor. Hun hadde det ikke godt med den stadige angsten for oss villstyringer av gutter. Hvorav jeg, som var den yngste, visst nok var den aller verste.
Petrus remembered himself and his brothers as both the perpetrators and the victims of many dreadful pranks and disasters. Everything from accidentally running down an old woman with a cartload of nails to sneaking into the insane asylum and frightening the patients. The first glimpse of their trouble appears in 1873 when Karl, at 19, was imprisoned for fighting and street disorder. But one of the most dramatic and best documented family stories happened 2 years later on Monday, June 28, 1875, to 8-year-old Oscar. That evening, shortly before 6:30 p.m., Oscar and his 5-year-old brother Petrus were sent out with a bag to gather kindling for the family. According to the meteorologist's report for the day, it had rained all morning, but by then the rain had stopped, the sky was overcast, and the temperature was 15 degrees Celsius. The 2 young boys had been told to go down the neighboring alley of Mollusmaue, where Assessor Bayer's house was under construction, and due to the ongoing work, the ground was covered with wood shavings, which was perfect for the family's fuel supply. Once the boys arrived, they wandered beneath the scaffolding where the men were working, but soon became distracted by their own imaginations. They sat by a small puddle and started playing with the wooden shavings as if they were ships at sea. Eventually, Oscar returned to the task at hand, while Petrus continued on his own make-believe voyage. But then, at the exact moment Oscar bent down to grab another handful, Carpenter Orsheim, one of the men above, shifted his footing, and that caused his axe, which he'd previously set down, to fall from the top of the building directly into Oscar's back, here. Oscar screamed, and fortunately, Dr. Vogt, who happened to be walking down the alley, heard him and rushed to the scene. Mrs. Steinlid, a kind woman who kept a small shop in the neighboring house, also heard Oscar and ran to him. Dr. Vogt lifted the boy and carried him home, accompanied by little Petrus and Mrs. Steinlid. Carolina and Stefan must have been horrified to see their child in the doctor's arms, but Vogt acted quickly. He summoned another physician, and together they stitched the long, deep wound with horsehair thread, leaving a small opening for potentially infected fluid to drain. The axe had landed close to the spine and severed several nerves. When Carolina asked whether her son would live, Vogt answered, "The wound is so deep that the child has very little chance to recover, but as long as there is life, there is hope." Oscar remained unconscious for days and stayed in bed for roughly 3 months. He later credited good medical skill and my mother's careful nursing for his recovery, along with the invisible assistance of heavenly intelligences. He suffered severe back pain for the rest of his life, but considering how close he came to death, he recovered remarkably well. In the winter of 1878, when Carolina was 53, she slipped on an icy sidewalk and dislocated her hip. Oscar wrote that she passed through much suffering and was crippled for the last 6 years of her life. During that time, she came to depend on Anna Sivertsen, a 50-year-old unmarried washerwoman. Anna moved in with them and took on the heaviest parts of the housework, washing clothes and scrubbing the floors once a week. Yet, even in this condition, Carolina remained an active mother and provider, and in 1882, she placed her first advertisement in Bergens Tidende. It read, "Stiff and soft ladies' and men's hats and caps are dyed and refurbished quickly, neatly, and cheaply. Carolina Einersen." The next dramatic story happened around 1882 when Petrus was 11 years old. By then, his older siblings had completed their schooling and confirmation. Carl was working as a set designer for Bergen's new theater, the Nationale Scene, while Martin, Stefanus, and Oscar had all found work at sea. Martin as a cook on a Danish schooner, Stefanus as a fireman on a fishing steamer, and Oscar as a steward on a passenger ship. As for Petrus, he was stuck at Lungegård Skole, studying geography, history, arithmetic, reading, writing, and his least favorite subject, religion. Eventually, Petrus decided to run away, and without telling anyone, he boarded the steamship Vesterålen while it was docked in Bergen, and the men took him in as a galley boy. Back at home, Carolina and Stefan were terrified, and feared that he had drowned in Lille Lungårdsvannet, where he often played, and had been dragged home as a soaking frozen mess multiple times. They contacted the police and searched the lake for his body, but nothing was found, and Carolina was left to mourn the possible death of yet another child. At last, Petrus wrote to Carolina to let her know where he was while the ship was docked in Bodø. Then, after at least 3 trips to northern Norway with Vesterålen, he returned home briefly before going off to sea again. This time, he signed on as a mess boy for a steamship bound for the Mediterranean. Carolina accompanied little Petrus to Sandviken, where the ship was docked, to say goodbye.
Mor, stakkars, hun gråt. For jeg var den minste, bare barnet. Hun syntes at jeg var så liten å komme ut blant fremmede, og så til sjøs, hvor hun ikke kunne holde øye med meg, og heller ikke kunne se meg.
Now all of her sons were out at sea, with the exception of her oldest, Carl. Considering the fate of her seafaring uncles and cousins, the fact that 4 of her 5 children worked at sea must have been a source of great anxiety for her. Despite all her hardships, Carolina fared far better than either of her siblings. Anna's husband was described as insane and was arrested on multiple occasions for theft and drunkenness. In the end, they were sentenced to Bergen's forced labor institution, where they lived for decades and died in abject poverty. Concerning Mikkel, 5 of his children died young from convulsions, scarlet fever, and the youngest, 6-year-old Henrik Marius, was burned alive when their home was destroyed by a fire. Mikkel, his wife, and 2 of their children survived the accident, but they lost everything they owned. They soon became dependent on welfare, and Mikkel was imprisoned 3 times for causing a disturbance at an inn and illegally practicing his trade, before ultimately dying in 1883. As Carolina approached her own death, she became increasingly concerned that her sons would be left with nothing. She couldn't depend on her husband, so she took matters into her own hands. Unknown to him, her children, or any relatives, Carolina opened a secret account at Bergens Sparebank, where she deposited her savings from hat repairing and rental income. She left the passbook in the care of her trusted washerwoman Anna and instructed her to divide the amount equally among her 5 sons after her death. In her weakened state, Carolina soon grew sick, and on March 22, 1886, she died at home from tuberculosis at 60 years old. Her final days were spent in the care of her remorseful husband Stefan, her loyal washerwoman Anna, and a live-in nurse named Malena. Tragically, only one of her sons, Karl, was present at the time of her death and for her funeral. The others were scattered across the world, as Martin was in Chile, Stefanus was at sea, Oscar was on a voyage to East India and China, and Petrus was in Italy. Following her death, Anna withdrew the money from Carolina's account, containing 250 kronor, which was nearly half of Stefan's annual salary. Then she divided it into 5 equal parts and faithfully delivered it to each of Carolina's sons. Carolina's fears regarding inheritance were justified, for when her husband died nearly 2 decades later, he left nothing behind for their children. Stefan Einarsson mourned the loss of his wife deeply. He wrote and published her death announcement in Bergens Tidende, which read, "Att min kära och gode hustru, mina böns kärliga moder, Carolina Margrethe Einarsson, hen sov rolig, det min tung lodd att bekjentgöra för släkt och vänner."
When my mother died, it had such an effect upon my father that he became a temperance man and never touched any intoxicating liquor during the remaining 20 years that he lived. At last, when 78 years of age, he died the 3rd of May 1905 from dropsy, tired and weary of life.
The only thing separating me from Carolina as I've followed her life story is time. I've walked the streets where she walked, I've lived in the city where she lived, and I've visited the house where she breathed her last breath. By all accounts, without exception, she was a remarkable woman. Most people are forgotten within 2 centuries, and even fewer are celebrated on the 200th anniversary of their birth. But today, I say with gratitude and wonder, gratulerer med dagen, Carolina.